leading again at the age of 92. Mahathir Mohamad comes out of political retirement in Malaysia to oust a former protege. Can the longest-serving Malaysian Prime Minister end anxiety about corruption and the high cost of living? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Voters in Malaysia have thrown the ruling coalition from power for the first time since independence 61 years ago. And the architect of the opposition's upset win is the veteran politician who made the ruling alliance a formidable force during his 22 years as Prime Minister. Mahathir Mohamad returned to active politics 2 years ago in an unusual role for him. As an opposition leader, he accused Prime Minister Najib Razak of stealing millions of dollars in government funds. And he's channeled the anger of millions of Malaysians about the rising cost of living and corruption into his latest electoral success, 2 months before his 93rd birthday. So who is Malaysia's new leader with a familiar face? He's Malaysia's longest-serving prime minister in power for 22 years, from 1981 until 2003. His economic policies attracted billions in investments to the so-called Asian tiger economy. He responded to the Asian currency crisis in 1997 by rejecting an International Monetary Fund bailout. Economists criticized him for capital controls on global investors. Despite that, he succeeded in reviving Malaysia's economy. But progress came at a cost. Mahathir was criticized for cracking down on political dissent, the media, and civil society. Lately, he's used democratic platforms he once opposed to challenge his former protege, Najib Razak, who's no stranger to scandal. Mahathir's upset victory comes after joining forces with Anwar Ibrahim, who's serving a 5-year sentence for sodomy. He was Mahathir's deputy before they fell out in the 1990s. Anwar and his supporters maintain the charges are politically motivated. Let's now get the thoughts of our guests. Joining us in Singapore, San. He is a senior advisor at the Asian Strategy and Leadership Institute in Malaysia. He was earlier political secretary to the outgoing Prime Minister Najib Razak. In Kuala Lumpur, Bridget Welsh. She is associate professor at John Cabot University. Bridget is the author of Regime Resilience in Malaysia and Singapore. And in London via Skype is Feng Xiu. She is Asia Regional Manager for the Economist Intelligence Unit. A warm welcome to all of you. Feng Xiu, I want to start with you. Explain to our viewers just how stunning of an upset victory this was for Mahathir Mohamad.
Aside from the newspaper describing the age differences between the two main contestants, Mahathir Mohamad being 92 and Najib Razak in his 50s, to put everything into context is an understanding of the United Malays National Organisation, and it's been in power in one form or another for the last 6 decades. So this is a complete upset, a complete change in the political landscape. The opposition got close in 2008, but at that point it only won something like 70-odd seats, not enough to cross the 112 margin that was needed. But this victory, not only have they crossed the parliamentary, got the parliamentary arithmetic in their favour, but they've also won control of something around about 6 of the state assemblies. This has never happened before for the opposition, ever. You know, they've never secured any numbers beyond the 70 mark. They've never secured anything of the state assembly controls beyond a handful. This actually is a complete change in the political landscape that very few people predicted.
San, is the political system as it exists in Malaysia even able to handle such a monumental shift?
Well, we inherited our political system from the British, and supposedly it is resilient enough to handle such a handle of powers from one administration to another. It's just that it has never been done before. So just like you will need rehearsals for certain concerts and other big events. Well, this is something which has no rehearsal, no precedent in Malaysian history, because as was mentioned, the Barisan National Government has in one form or another ruled Malaysia for more than half a century. So I think going forward, Malaysians would indeed adopt a new mentality that it is possible to change government, and if the Mahathir administration is not to their liking, it will also similarly be kicked out of power.
Yeah. Bridget Welsh, do you foresee Dr. Mahathir having as much political sway as he held in the past?
Actually, I think in some ways he will have more, in that his mandate was massive coming into office. We're talking about almost 20 to 25% swings in voters and constituencies. And unlike in the past where he came in from the system, he's coming in as a comeback person, someone at the age of 92, the oldest living leader in the world right now. And he is seen as actually coming in to make changes, to try to make the system better, to correct some of the mistakes that he made when he was in office from 1981 to 2003. So I think he's going to be, in some ways, powerful, very powerful. He's also a man in the hurry, so he's not planning to stay long. So I think that this is going to create a dynamism to his administration that I think will be very important as Malaysia moves forward.
Fung Siu, I want to pick up on something that Bridget was just mentioning, the fact that it's expected that Dr. Mahathir will not want to stay long. It's expected that he will pardon Anwar Ibrahim and that perhaps he will appoint him also as Prime Minister in the coming months or years. Do you think that's really going to happen? How long do you envision Dr. Mahathir would stay in power at this stage?
There was always a prior arrangement between the two gentlemen well before Mahathir's party joined the Pakatan Harapan. So just to confirm that, or rather repeat, that that arrangement remains in place. And it's not up to Mahathir to pardon him. He has to actually move for a royal pardon. And once that happens, then that means that Anwar Ibrahim will be able to contest for political office. And I would envisage that this will take place within the next 12 months. I do believe that Mahathir Mohamad will honour the arrangement that he had in place before this landslide victory. So definitely, I do. So Mohammed, I agree that Mahathir is actually definitely in a hurry, but I think it will be Anwar Ibrahim who will actually be making the policy decisions. He'll be advising Mahathir who to put in his cabinet, and this will be the next test. Actually, who goes in the cabinet? Some of these ministers, would-be ministers, are untried, untested. And who does he actually go for a representational sort of cabinet where they draw people from all the different parties? Or will he actually go for a more a slanted cabinet whereby he actually tries to get as much done as possible in the year that he's got left? But I don't think he'll be making any of the major decisions on his own. I think Anwar Ibrahim will be there in the background. They'll be doing it together.
All right, so speaking of tests, Oe-san, what do you think are some of the most immediate political challenges Dr. Mahathir faces now?
Well, his most immediate political challenge would be, for example, how would he put together a cabinet which is representative of both the component parties of his coalition, the Harapan coalition, as well as more broadly of the racial and religious as well as regional makeups of Malaysia. I mean, in addition to that, he would have to, well, as he repeatedly promised and as his coalition also repeatedly promised, to sort of restore the independence and the confidence of the judiciary, the Attorney General's Department of Chambers, as well, more broadly the political system at large. Then we will go to issues such as the abolition of various taxes which a lot of people do not support and enjoy. I think those will be his more immediate challenges. And in the long run, it's of course reviving the Malaysian economy. Yeah.
Bridget Welsh, Prime Minister Najib has been under a lot of pressure. Of course, There are these accusations of fraud in the multi-billion-dollar state fund. He's denied the allegations, of course, but how much did this hurt him politically? Is this, in fact, an instance of perceived state-sponsored corruption being voted out of office?
Just to add a bit more earlier on to some of the comments just now about Mahathir, I think Mahathir is going to be around more than a year. And I think comparatively he comes in with a much stronger mandate. Anwar had a chance to take over power and electorally in 2013, and he didn't make it. Mahathir does have a larger mandate, and I think he will play more of a role that's been suggested. And one of the reasons for that is he's been able to oust Najib Razak. And Najib, as Ihsan has mentioned just a few moments ago, has faced concerns about economic issues such as the goods and service tax, which is something many Malaysians have really felt a lot of anger towards. It's a tax that has basically brought people into the tax base that had never been taxed before, and that anger was felt at the polls because it's been seen to be associated with economic hardship. But the other issue, as you've just mentioned, has been the issue of corruption and kleptocracy charges. We're looking at a huge scandal, 1MDB, which I'm sure many of you have heard all over the news in the last 3 years. We see this has involved investigations in multiple jurisdictions, and it involved $700 million put into Najib's own personal bank account and funds that were stretching into the range of $4 billion. Here in Malaysia, charges were not moved ahead. He was supposedly cleared of all wrongdoing. And many Malaysians felt that this was actually an improper process, and not only were they angry about this for the lack of accountability and the way some of these funds were being spent, but they were also very concerned about the damage to Malaysia's reputation internationally, and national pride was a factor that Mahathir used in his campaign. So while many people don't understand the particulars, especially in the rural areas, the sentiment of anger was crystallized over this particular scandal and corruption issues.
Fang Xiu, if we could expand a bit on what Bridget was just saying, do you expect there to be a crackdown because of the 1MDB scandal that would happen now? And also, just how vulnerable do you think that Mr. Najib is to potential prosecution at this stage?
With regard to retrying or even opening up the investigation against Najib Razak, well, the Anti-Corruption Authority has already investigated. He's already been investigated by the Attorney General, and in both instances he's been cleared of all charges. I'm not sure that they would probably try to bring those charges back into play again, and simply because at the moment it would seem it would then say that the institutions that exonerated Najib Razak were wrong in the first place. So I think they're going to avoid that route for the time being. And in terms of going forward with other things that are actually priorities, I think the focus for the newly formed government will be on policy. And as Bridget very rightly mentions, that people there are very concerned about the cost of living introduced by the goods and services tax way back in 2015. The move now is, and the promise that was made was that they would actually abolish this particular policy initiative. Going ahead, that will be the policy focus, but whether they'll succeed in abolishing it straight away, again, that would require consultation again, I believe, with Anwar Ibrahim. And looking at it in the revival of the economy did really well last year. It grew by 5.9%. It's just keeping that pace. And I think there's enough momentum in the economy to make sure that Malaysia actually does make it to become a high-income country by 2020.
Bridget, it looked to me a moment ago like you had something you wanted to say. Did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I respectfully disagree about the assessment of whether or not the charges will move forward. I think Mahathir, in repeated press conferences in the last few days, has emphasized the return to the rule of law and questioned the issues of integrity of the previous administration. My expectations is we're going to see, once he's sworn in government, that you're going to see heads roll, new people be appointed, cases opened up, and one of those cases that will be opened up will be the 1MDB scandal. Given the scope of it and how it's affected Malaysia's finances, it's not just about Najib Razak, it's about the financial well-being of Malaysia and its reputation, and I think Mahathir understands that. I also say that while there's important economic growth that has been significant under the Najib administration, and in fact, Najib should be credited with moving the country forward outside of after the economic crisis of 2008 and 2009, that much of that growth is not felt by ordinary Malaysians, and those numbers that are touted are not those that felt on the ground. 40% of Malaysians are living with very low incomes in those income brackets. They heavily rely on state subsidies, and as a result, I think that there are real big challenges of inequality and social mobility that I think the Mahathir government will have to face moving forward.
Son, what are your thoughts on some of what you just heard from Bridget and Feng Xiu? And also, could you talk to our viewers about some of the other reasons why voters were so angry and why they voted the way they did in Malaysia?
Well, I think as regards the 1MDB series of scandals, I think now that Mr. Najib is no longer the head of government of a sovereign country, his sovereign immunity would very much be lifted. And a lot of those jurisdictions, such as the United States and Switzerland, as well as several other international jurisdictions, which previously were sort of reticent in naming Mr. Najib directly, would now do so. And even if the Malaysian authorities were not to take up those charges, I think those foreign authorities will now bring forward criminal charges, and it's up to the Malaysian government, the new Malaysian government, to decide whether to sort of extradite Mr. Najib for those trials. And then as to what are some of the reasons why people rejected BN, I think it's mainly because over the past 60 years or so, it has evolved into an extremely corrupt regime, corrupts to its very core and at multiple levels. Because, well, there's a Chinese saying, if the top of the rank it's not straight enough, then the whole thing would come sort of tumble down. So you see corruption at every single level. You see corruption it sort of infused into both the public and private sectors. Many people are on the take. So this is sort of a saying no to this sort of very crooked and twisted development for a country which should have been very great, endowed with natural resources and abundant human resources.
Feng Xiu, I want to ask you about the economy, because Dr. Mahathir was really seen as the figure that transformed the economy of Malaysia, being this sort of backwater economy, not being very developed, into becoming this real force in Southeastern Asia, being perceived as this economic tiger. Could you tell our viewers a little bit about what the economy was like in Malaysia before Dr. Mahathir took power, and then how he transformed it and where it stands now?
So before he transformed it, it was very reliant on primary products as their export market. But what they did during the time of Mahathir was to actually focus on the assembly of electronic goods, and also basically taking advantage of the low cost base that the labour force had to offer. And in that regard, it has actually expanded in that area where exports of goods and services accounted for something like from very low proportion to, at the height, which was probably a few years ago, to around about 200% of nominal GDP. That's quite an achievement to increase your external sector as a proportion of GDP to that sort of scale. Going forward, there are challenges. So basically, at the moment, the economy is sort of like hit a bit of a wall, and you can say that it's actually got itself trapped in this middle income trap. And what it needs to do is diversify now a little bit away from the electronics assembly, because China's getting much better at it. And now think about services, really, trying to make its services sector as big as possible, diversify into that, rebalance into that. Which I think, with the population, with the educational levels, they can actually do.
Bridget Welsh, what do you expect Malaysian voters will be seeing when it comes to new economic policies introduced by Dr. Mahathir?
Well, I think largely the focus of Mahathir's administration, I think, will be on political reforms as opposed to economic issues. In terms, he's talking about introducing political term limits, which of course many people will recognize as ironic that he himself served 5 terms, and also some fundamental shifts in terms of the power structure. He stated that he is Prime Minister, that he will not be Finance Minister at the same time, which is of course unlike Najib Razak, and this is where some of those corruption issues and allegations have been made. So I think we're going to see more of a focus initially on some political dimensions compared to economic ones. But I do think the economy was and is very much on Malaysians' minds, and this involves 2 different sets of issues. On one side, it involves continuing to find new sources of growth in a very different type of regional context than where Mahathir governed, and in a very different stage of development where Mahathir governed Malaysia. At that time, he was focused heavily on hard development in terms of modernization, building infrastructure and services. Today, the real challenge is to build the soft capacity building and enhancing the education system. And also, at that time, there was diversified investments coming into the region and multiple sources and a much more powerful and economically engaged United States. Now he has to work with China, which is the dominant regional player and a global player in the economy. And of course, also there was a contentious issues in the campaign, particularly some of their investment within the context of Malaysia, and as being charged as actually having contributing in funds towards the 1MDB scandal, payoff of debt, and so forth. So I think we're going to see a focus on soft capacity issues and investment in people. And on the other side, you're also going to have more engagement with these concerns about social mobility and concerns about inequality. My expectation is that there will be new social programs being brought in to address these issues. There's talk already here in Kuala Lumpur of bringing people into the cabinet with technocratic expertise. And he will also rely heavily on some of his former financial advisors who played roles in the campaign to help and serve to convince many in the business community that Malaysia is open for business and that there will be considerable dynamism in the economy moving forward.
Oh, Ihsan, we can't have this discussion until we've talked a little bit about Dr. Mahathir's human rights record, because when he was previously in power, he was seen as being not very tolerant when it comes to dissent. He was seen as having embraced authoritarian figures and governments. So what can we expect to see when it comes to his human rights record? And do we expect that Dr. Mahathir will be more tolerant of dissent and critics this time?
Well, I grew up during the Mahathir era, and he was indeed a very much hated figure because he trampled upon the development of democracy as well as human rights in Malaysia. But the Mahathir we see nowadays appears to be a very different Mahathir than previously. Granted, he still has all his wits and so on, but we see a very much mellowed down Mahathir. And also within his ruling coalition, there are various of these, the democratic figures, some of whom fought against his regime many years ago. And he has to, in a sense, rely upon their support. Otherwise, his government would also tumble down. So I think he will be very much, number one, mellowed down, and number two, constrained by some of his coalition partners. So I do not expect the same level of, shall we say, negative human rights record as was with his first administration.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to end the discussion there. Thanks to all our guests, O.E. San, Bridget Welsh, and Feng Xiu. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.